Welcome back everybody to our studies in A-level history. In this video we're going to be talking about social changes between 1886 and 1914, focusing specifically on trade unions and the rise of this new unionism movement, ideas relating to syndicalism, as well as the issue of female emancipation, the growth of the urban population, and the expansion of service industries, as well as the basic standards of living. So quite a lot to cover in this lesson, but fundamentally we're going to begin by thinking about the rise of trade unions in the 19th century, the late 19th century. Essentially, we see that even though the trade union movement had evolved throughout the 19th century, and we sort of see that as the result of things like the Combination Acts, we've got a relationship of change among the trade unions and the relationship between them and the state. But by the late 1800s, the unions were still somewhat quite weak, and they were still relatively fragmented. Most unions represented skilled workers and had limited power due to their small size and to the lack of legislative protections on workers. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the ideas of unions began to grow significantly, and this was partially driven by economic hardships, but also the rise of industrialization and the emergence of new forms of collective action. And so fundamentally then, the rise of the new unionism movement begins in around 1889 and represents a movement which shifts towards mass-based unionization, particularly for those who are unskilled and semi-skilled workers. This was in contrast with earlier unions, which had represented mainly skilled trades. A key feature of this new unionism movement, then, was its efforts to organize workers in industries that had been previously very difficult to unionize, including things like dock workers, transport workers, and unskilled laborers. In 1889, we see one of the most important moments in the rise of new unionism. This is the London dock strike, led by key figures such as Ben Tillett. The dock workers successfully demanded higher wages, better working conditions, and the right to unionize. This victory demonstrated the power of collective action among the unskilled labourers and the unskilled workforce, and inspired similar movements across the country. And we see then a number of very key figures, Ben Tillett being one such example, Tom Mann being another, and so too was James Larkin, who all promoted the idea of unionism for all workers, not just a select few skilled workers. Their success encouraged other workers, including those in textile mills and coal mines, to form unions as well. And so fundamentally then, new unionism plays a very pivotal role in improving the conditions of the working classes. Its impact stretched well beyond just their economic gains. So for example, workers' rights to organize and strike were increasingly recognized by both the employers of the people who are seeking the right to strike and the state. Additionally, this idea and the success of new unionism helped pave the way for what ultimately becomes the development and the rise of the Labour Party in the early 20th century. Syndicalism also emerges in Britain in the early 20th century, again influenced by some movements, syndicalist movements in places like France and Italy. Syndicalism called for direct action and a general strike as a way of overthrowing the capitalist system. Syndicalists believed that workers, through their control of key industries such as railways, docks, and factories, could bring about revolutionary change without having to rely on political parties or parliamentary reforms. Now, ultimately, while syndicalism did not gain much of a mass following in Britain, for the most part, it still nevertheless did have influence on militant factions within the union movement. So, for example, the National Union of Rail, Maritime and Transport Workers, the RMT, and the shop steward movements both became illustrations of things that were influenced by the sort of militant syndicalist ideas. Figures like Tom Mann and James Larkin were associated with syndicalist ideas, particularly in their promotion of direct action and strikes. During this period too, female emancipation, essentially the right for women's rights to vote, became increasingly important. Women, particularly from middle and working classes, began to organise for political and social rights, including things like rights to education, workplace rights, and, as I've already mentioned, the rights to suffrage. Now, women's suffrage movements can be divided broadly into a number of different categories, a number of different rights-based organisations that essentially attempted to deal with the rights of women's suffrage in different ways. You have, for example, the suffragists movement, the push for women's rights, the rights of women's suffrage rights, the rights to vote, being one of the most important social movements of the period. And we see that groups within the suffragist movement, such as the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, that was led by Millicent Fawcett, campaigned for women's rights to vote through peaceful and through legal means. Essentially, their methods was to focus on persuading Parliament to grant women the right to vote, often working within the existing political structure. By contrast, the suffragette movement was a far more radical wing of the suffrage process, the suffrage movement, and it was led by people like Emmeline Pankhurst and the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU. And they would use militant tactics instead to try and get the right to vote on the ballot for women. So, such as hunger strikes, arson, and disruptive protests. The slogan of the Women's Social and Political Union was, quote, "deeds, not words," and it captured their belief in direct action to try and secure the rights for women to vote. The government's response to the suffragettes specifically were often quite harsh. Women would be arrested, imprisoned, and force-fed during their hunger strikes. This would increasingly draw public attention to the issue. Eventually, the Representation of the People Act of 1918 granted the rights of women over 30 who met certain property qualifications the right to full suffrage. The rights for full suffrage for women over 21 would not be achieved until 1928, slightly beyond the conversation we're having so far. We also see other aspects of female emancipation being a very key issue during this period. Women also campaigned for improved access to higher education, as well as the ability to work in professional sectors. In the late 19th and early 20th century, for example, women's employment was concentrated in low-paying, often very exploitative jobs, so teaching, domestic services, and factory work. The suffragist and feminist movements worked to expand the opportunities of women in education and employment, but the progress was very, very slow. Equally, and as we noted in previous videos, specifically looking at the economy during this time period, during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Britain saw rapid urbanization that was driven by industrialization and the growth of cities. So, for example, by 1911, over 50% of the population lived in urban areas. This was compared to just 20% by the turn of the century from 17 to 1800. We also see that people from rural areas, especially those in agricultural cotton industries, moved to more industrial cities, such as Manchester, Birmingham, and Glasgow, in order to search for works at mills and other industrial sectors. The growth of these cities, of course, as we've noted in previous videos, led to poor housing quality. Many urban areas were characterised by overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. Often, working-class people would live in tenements or slums. As the cities expanded, the problems of sanitation and overcrowding would continue even further. We also see that there is long hours and very poor working conditions during this time period, but it should be noted as an example of the sort of counter-argument that industrialization did lead to some improvements, particularly in areas like transportation and communication, as the cities began to develop even greater and more modern infrastructure services. We also see that alongside the traditional industries, the early 20th century saw the growth of the service industries. These sectors expanded the British economy beyond just that of metalworks or cotton or iron or coal, but more towards things that were more service-oriented, especially after the industrial boom. So we see, for example, retail businesses such as department stores beginning to flourish during this time, with the middle class creating a demand for consumer goods. Banking and insurance services also grew in importance, particularly as the result of Britain's dominance in global finance. Telecommunications, transportation, and education services also expanded, particularly in large cities. The expansion and the establishment of things like, for example, municipal services such as water, gas, and electricity made urban life a bit more bearable. As industries began to grow as well, so too did the demand for the professional work environment. So places and sectors such as, for example, accounting and law and medicine, leading to the creation of a more structured middle class and a growing demand for specialized knowledge. We've already noted in previous videos the sort of general living conditions during this time. Many people within the working class lived in poverty. They had to endure quite long working hours and dangerous working conditions. There were, however, improvements in places and areas like housing and healthcare and education for some, particularly in areas where social reform had begun to take hold. The middle class, particularly the professional and the white-collar jobs, would experience rising income and better living conditions. This led to the growth of what we call a consumer culture, with goods like clothing and household items becoming more accessible for the middle class. And we know that from previous lessons, the rural population began to face significant stagnation as agricultural prices fell and the traditional farming methods were increasingly outcompeted by cheaper foreign imports from places like America and Germany, for example. The result is that there is a stagnation in the agricultural sector. But by the early 20th century, rural areas saw some improvement due to the better building of things like infrastructure. So the building of better roads, the greater amount of railways and railroads, the increase in transportation options, all led to slight changes in living conditions and improvements in living conditions as we go through the turn of the century and up to the point at which we begin our understandings and our conversations surrounding the beginning of the First World War.